Hi class, today we will be talking about experimental designs. So this is corresponding with chapter 8 in your text. So I'm going to do this in two parts just so that way our lectures don't go on for too long and you can kind of split up the material and take a look at it. So let's go ahead and get started. So with our last chapter, we talked about survey research. And just like we can use these techniques to, with our survey research, we can collect a lot of data on a group of people with sort of a written method. With our experimental design, we can think about looking at some of these manipulations, right? To see if when I give one group of participants a manipulation and I differ that with my control group, how does the results differ? So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So to begin with, we probably should define what an experiment is. And an experiment is a type of research design that involves manipulation. So again, the hallmark of the experimental design is going to be that manipulation. And the manipulation in this case of our independent variable. And by doing this, it allows us to kind of control for other things taking place in our environment. So what we're really paying attention to, or rather the dependent variable, ends up being a result of the manipulation that's occurring with the independent variable, right? So we want to see the outcome. We can do small n designs, and this is an experiment that's conducted with one or few participants, and we do this to maybe better understand a behavior that we typically didn't know too much about previously. I will say that in most psychological research, we tend not to have these small study designs, and a lot of this comes down to looking at multiple variables. So if we were only going to be looking at maybe one variable, then you could probably still find effects with a smaller sample size. Most often we want to know about how multiple different variables affect a behavior. And so when we do that, we actually need to increase our sample size. This will be associated with something called power. And you'll kind of talk about this when you get into statistics, but also kind of graduate statistics if you end up going that route. So again, having that larger sample size does allow us to find effects that we may not otherwise find in a small n with a small sample size. Okay, so kind of going back and doing a brief review, an independent variable is going to be a variable in an experiment that is manipulated by the researcher. And this can be levels of the variable and kind of changes across or within subjects. This could also be a participant's gender, their personality. You can even look at smoking status, but these things wouldn't be independent variables in an experimental design. And the question is, why might that be? Well, I hope you say, I can't manipulate those things, and that would be correct, right? So I can't manipulate a person's gender. I can't manipulate a person's personality or their smoking status. This is what the person identifies with or what the person is. And so I could not, in an experimental design, use those as an independent variable. It could be used as an independent variable in a correlational design, and this is because, again, as a refresher, we're simply looking at relationships. So in that case, we could actually use those things that I just mentioned as independent variables. But in experimental design, we cannot, because they cannot be manipulated. So thinking about a experimental design, or let's kind of go back to our correlational design. And I gave you the example of Biggie's song, "The more money we come across, the more problems we see," right? Money is related to problems. And, I asked the question, can we say that money causes more problems? So having more money causes having more problems. And the answer to that is no, because at least as was noted in the song, this is simply a relationship, right? We're saying that when we have more money, we seem to see an increase in problems. But we aren't necessarily saying that we can't say money causes problems, because there are lots of things that can influence that relationship between money and problems. And we call this that sort of third variable, right? And the only way we could say if money causes problems is by manipulating creating an experimental design. So randomly assigning some people to have money and some people not to have money, and then seeing how that relates to the number of problems that they report. So looking at this, a third variable is defined as the presence of an extraneous factor in a study that affects the dependent variable and can decrease the internal validity of a study. And we have to consider all third variables in any relationship. Frequently, what we do with this in experimental design is use any of these extraneous factors as a control in our research design. And I can talk to you about that a little bit more during our class, but how we can kind of set that up. So a confounding variable, as your book defines, is an extraneous factor present in a study that may affect the results. So for example, the time of day that I decided to conduct my experiment. Maybe in one study, I gave just a little bit different instructions than I gave in the other group. All of these things could actually impact and influence my outcome. And it's not a direct result of the manipulation of my independent variable. So when you conduct a research study, an experimental study, you have to think about controlling for those confounding variables, right? How do you kind of create those controls? And so as I had previously mentioned, we can use those controls as within our research design. We can actually assess those variables as well, and we can plug those into the model. But again, I'm really happy to go over this for you when we are in person. So one of the things to really consider about an experimental design is we want good internal validity, right? So kind of going back to internal validity, this is our ability to draw conclusions about the causal relationship from our data. Here, we have to ask, the results can be attributed to the effect of the independent variable, and experiment must be designed and conducted so that only the independent variable can cause the result, right? So kind of going back to this slide, thinking about those third variables, thinking about those confounding variables, and how those are impacting the study. Again, a good study with good internal validity is going to be able to control those confounding variables and really think about those third variable problems. All right, so now I want to talk to you all about basic experiments or basic experimental designs. So we could do a design where we simply give a experiment or not, and then take a look at the measurement after, right? So we can look at our independent variable and how it relates to our dependent variable. So here we might have a post-test only design. In order to do a post-test only design, we have to have 2 equivalent groups of participants. We have to introduce the independent variable. So we have to have our control group, and then we have to have our experimental group. And then we will then measure the effect of the independent variable on our dependent variable. So some of the difficulties we might have here is equating the groups. So making sure the groups are equal in sort of all facets, and eliminating any potential confounding variables, right? Confounding variables to the independent variable. So what does this look like in sort of an illustration? Okay, so our independent variable here would be either our experiment or control. Okay, so first we bring in a group of individuals into our lab, and then we randomly assign them to be a part of the experimental condition or the control condition. And then we then give them some outcome measures. So in this case, our dependent variable, and we see if these differ based on being in the experimental group or the control group, right? So let's say that we're looking at getting PowerPoint notes or not getting PowerPoint notes, and then how well you do on an exam. Okay, so in one group, I give them the PowerPoint notes, the other ones don't get anything, and then we take a look at their post-test or their measure. In this case, maybe it's an exam, and we see if there's any differences in their exam scores based on whether they got the PowerPoints or not. All right. So now, when we think about this design here, one of the issues that we have is, well, what else is taking place that could also potentially influence this outcome, right? Is this really, are people just doing better because of the measure that I'm giving them, right? The independent variable that I'm giving them, so the PowerPoint notes are not, or is there something else that might be taking place? So we can then move to having a pre-test and a post-test design. And what that means is we take our sample, we collect data, and so basically we're collecting the dependent variable first. Then we give our subjects our independent variable, and then we collect our dependent variable again. And we try to see what the shifts are between time 1 and time 2. Okay? So in this case, what we are trying to see is if I have a better picture of what a person's score was before. So I could give all of my participants a test, see what their score is, then randomly assign one group to get PowerPoint notes and the other group not to have PowerPoint notes, and then give them the test again, right? So now I can see if there are any shifts, if one group might have scored higher before the experiment started or not, right? So I can make sure that the shifts we're seeing are a direct result of the independent variable, not some other confounding variable. One of the things to consider with this type of design is that it can be pretty time consuming to do, right? So with my pre-test or my post-test only design, I really only have to see participants in the lab once, or even within that a smaller duration of time. When I get to my pre-test, post-test design, here I'm going to have my sample. I'll give them their dependent variable, right? I then give my independent variable. So here I ask you to take an exam, see what your score is. I then either give you PowerPoint notes or don't, and then I give you the test one more time. So now I'm actually with my participants for a longer period of time. And this can be fairly time consuming. The other aspect to think about is when I've got multiple groups to this effect, I actually need significantly more participants to be able to see any significant effects. So at minimum, in a very basic pre-test, post-test design, I'm going to need at least 20 or 30 participants per condition. The more conditions I add, the more participants that I'm going to need. So keep this in mind when you're thinking about these basic experimental designs. One way for us to kind of get around